Welcome back to Demystify Sci. I'm Shiloh.
I'm Anastasia.
Today we are talking about autism, human hybridization, and punctuated equilibrium. And to guide us through that discussion, we have Emily Casanova, who is a professor of psychology at Loyola University. And she is very interested in the intersection of these somewhat disparate ideas as they relate to the prevalence and cause of autism. Because autism is one of those squeaky disorders that seems to be more prevalent now than ever. And the more that people try to pin it down to some genetic cause or a particular environmental cause, the more that it seems to squirm away from either one of those identities. And of course, we recently released our conversation with Forrest Merady, where we talk a lot about the environmental side of that disorder. I don't think that it made that part of the conversation made it onto YouTube, but if you're listening at one of the other podcast platforms, you probably caught that conversation. And Forrest is of the persuasion that it is essentially an entirely environmental issue. But there's problems with that too. Like, why does it only affect some people, right? If we're all exposed to the same toxins, shouldn't we all be autistic by now? But on the other hand, the geneticists have a hard time too, because even in these twin studies, monozygotic twins, where you have 100% identity between the phenotypes of the offspring, they have the same genes. So something like eye color or hair color, it's always the same. It's very close to 100%. But you don't ever get that close, even in twin studies with autism. So there seems to be a little bit of both going on. And Emily is helping us untangle that and look deep into the past at how different events in our evolutionary history could have led to the moment that we're at right now. And what does that look like for the future, too? Where are we headed? Where's our evolution taking us? Is autism part of that discussion?
Something that I was really surprised by was that Emily has found linkages with autism in DNA that was inherited from Neanderthals. And so there's this claim that autism first appears in the 1930s and 40s when Hans Asperger and there's another guy in the United States, I can't remember his name, Leonard something, where they identify this disorder, they write it up in the Annals of Child Psychiatry, and now all of a sudden the disease has first appeared, which is why it's easy to pin it to an environmental cause, because there was a lot of environmental, industrial changes that were happening at the time. But Emily's like, no, these genes, these networks of relationships that we have identified as being contributive to the development of autism actually long predate any kind of 1930s starting point. And so it's really interesting because as we get this genetic information, it also forces her to start to look at, well, wait a second, what is the actual story of the intermixing of humans and Neanderthals? Because it seems like it's much more complicated than just Homo sapiens coming through, destroying the Neanderthal populations, and then flourishing in the aftermath of that destruction. It seems like a very deep, intertwined history where there's extensive genetic exchange, and in that genetic exchange, there is the integration of autism-related genes into the human genome. And she said something really interesting in the podcast where she was like, look, after that event, there also appears to be a massive cultural renaissance that happens in Homo sapiens, and we go down the path of developing everything that we associate with modern humans today, and that doesn't seem incidental. And so it's this very, very interesting story of the appearance of a genetic basis, a cultural shift, which obviously took a very long time for us to get to the present with, but it still offers this tantalizing idea that our picture of autism as being a disease of the last 100 years is not actually the case.
Yeah, it brings up the evolutionary role of it too. Like, even treating it as a disease per se might not always be the appropriate term.
I think that people don't actually use that term.
Right. I mean, there is a movement, right? Just like you see in hearing disabled, visually disabled people too, right? Where it's like, no, this is just who we are, right?
And I think that the strong case can be made.
In some cases, right? There's a lot of debilitating cases of autism,
Exactly.
of course, right? And I think that what would you say, the advantageous side is much smaller of a population, but there's something to it also.
It's actually the profoundly disabled population is only about a quarter of cases.
What about the savantisms?
Is
I
savantism?
think it's very, very small population. But yeah, we're just talking out of our asses here.
Here we are.
Oh God, forgive us.
But I think that the point is that it's really complicated because it's obviously something that's been getting a lot more attention recently. It's a really hot button topic because the people who have autism, people with autism, are not really interested in having it be labeled as a disorder or as a disease. And there's plenty of other people on the other side that are attempting to look at it from the standpoint of, well, this is a neurological anomaly and we seek to understand it and we seek to fix it and reverse it. And Emily kind of doesn't go down that road. She's like, look, I'm a basic science researcher. I'm a geneticist. I'm a psychology professor. I just want to know how this stuff works. I want to understand where it comes from, where it's going. And I don't have a dog in the fight of this is good or this is bad. My dog is let's figure out what this is, which I really appreciate because I think that basic research gives you a lot more space to play and explore and seek than this bullet target paradigm of medical technology.
Yeah, it's my favorite kind of science for sure. What the heck is going on? Just because that's really good to know. I think it's really good. So, by the way, podcast is entirely supported by listeners like you. If you can scrape off a tiny piece of your paycheck, the tiniest piece, and come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and support us, it will go a long way to making sure that we can put more and more of our effort towards this project. Plus, if you join our Patreon, you get to hang out with us once a week, tell us your thoughts, and contribute to the actual design of this show, which we love seeing you guys. If you're already a patron, thank you so much.
And if you don't have any cash, that's totally fine. I've spent most of my life in that position. You can leave a comment. You can share the podcast with your friends. You can subscribe. You can rate it on the podcast platforms.
If you don't have any money to support podcasts, but you do need to buy some new t-shirts, we can also help you out with that. Down below, we have a link to the description. They're cheap. They're as cheap as we can possibly print them, but you can rep Demystify Sci around your town, and that would be awesome too.
With that said, enjoy the conversation with Dr. Emily Casanova, and we'll see you next time.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The Demystify Sci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Obviously, there tends to be a lot of social anxiety and anxiety in general in autism. But definitely, we have seen an explosion in diagnostic rates. That can be different from prevalence. We have seen some major changes, even though the word autism came into being back in the early 40s. That was, kind of the first published manuscripts on autism with like Leo Kanner, and then also Hans Asperger, who published his on Asperger's a year later, or autistic psychopathy. They've been around for a while, but in practice, they really haven't been used a whole lot. And they actually didn't make it into the DSM. Autistic disorder didn't make it in until the very early 80s. So technically, it actually hasn't been that long. So I think we've seen a rise in popularity in part because, first off, the psychiatric community became more aware of it. And I think over time, we have broadened our conceptions of what that there is a spectrum, right? Because it wasn't considered a spectrum before. And that's not just simply adding Asperger's in the 90s, but even just understanding what all autism could be. Traditionally, those who had more severe intellectual disability accompanying that, they were less likely to receive the autism diagnosis because it's harder to kind of parse those apart. So those people tended not to get identified. And then, of course, the other people who had IQs more within the normal or even above average range, perhaps people who might be considered more high masking nowadays, those were not identified until much more recently, right? And I think also that concept of the spectrum has just continued to broaden, even well beyond the 90s, when Asperger's kind of had its early heyday.
So you don't think that it's really exploded? Sounds like you think that we see
Exploded.
it. It's
I
more
don't.
visible.
Explosion, no. I am not averse to the idea that there may be fluctuations in actual prevalence rate, especially as we do know that there's a lot of potential environmental exigencies that can play roles in autism. I think that's probably varied, over time. Maybe we have more now. I mean, I know we've got a ton of various xenosteroids that are in our diets and we're constantly exposed to, and those certainly are of concern with conditions like autism or stuff like breast cancer and things like that. Um,
Plastics, I guess.
yeah, all those microplastics that are just, we all have them, right? They're living within us. And that's just one example, right? A lot of the pathways that we found associated with autism in a molecular sense are intended to be at least somewhat plastic. There's definitely receives input from systems like the hormones, the endocrine system, as well as the immune system, and those are invariably going to fluctuate over generations. I just shudder to think what London was like in the 1800s and all of the absolute crap they had in their environment and their diet. I'm sure there was probably an uptick in all sorts of conditions related to that as well. So,
Yeah, I was
uh,
going to ask you about that just in the sense
mhm,
because we started with this idea of the cell phone as security blanket, and it
mhm,
seems hard to imagine that there isn't a technological shift that's causing a consequent psychological shift.
yeah,
And
yeah,
so when you look through the history of psychology, do people have a sense that there's a feedback between either technology or industry
mhm,
and environment and the development of various psychological conditions? Or is it viewed more in isolation as, well, there's this new thing that Connor discovers and it's
right,
just comes out of nowhere and
right,
utterly
right.
mysterious?
Well, I think to a certain extent, the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, especially with all of the MMR debate and everything, has certainly influenced, excuse me, certainly influenced some of our concepts with this idea of autism has exploded. This is something that's more new. Maybe it was there, but it wasn't to the extent that we see it now. And, you know, some of the problem is historically it's really hard. I mean, undoubtedly you can identify cases, right? Historical cases, especially if it maybe individuals who were perhaps of the nobility, so they were usually they had a better records of them, but also maybe they did really interesting things, whether it's in physics or the creative arts or any of those things. I mean, there's been a bunch of post-mortem, kind of ad hoc diagnostics, not official, but discussing things about, for instance, Lewis Carroll that may have been somewhat autistic and things like that. But as far as to try and go back in historical records and identify prevalence, I don't think that's going to be possible. So to be able to say definitively, this is the rough percentage we see today. This is about the rough percentage that we saw in the earlier 20th century. And then this is the one in 1800s. And I don't think we'd be able to do that. From what I have experienced in terms of my study of autism, all the things that potentially lend to it, whether from the genetic side or from the environmental side, because there's definitely both. Um, you would expect the genetics maybe to change a little bit with population fluctuations like we're seeing. Honestly, you might expect to see it go down a bit. Usually the larger population numbers, if there's something that harms health, and I'm not saying necessarily autism harms health, but we definitely see physical conditions that can come alongside with autism, stuff that may not be so great for health and fecundity, which inevitably may influence how those genes are passed down. So that maybe has fluctuated a little bit. Environment is probably some of the biggest stuff that can potentially fluctuate. And we do know that there's a number of potential environmental stressors that can play a role. On the other hand, we know that, for instance, maternal immune activation has definitely links with increased likelihood that the child may develop autism if that's occurring during pregnancy. So if we have hopefully decreased the extent of maternal infections, that probably would decrease that likelihood. So there's going to be honestly different, stuff like hormone stuff that's probably gone up a bit. Immune stuff, maybe that's gone down a little bit, except as maybe it's related to hormones because they love to they have a lot of crosstalk between those systems. But it's going to fluctuate a bit. I would expect some fluctuation over time.
In addition to so you mentioned the environmental and the genetic suspects.
Mhm.
Is there an element I don't know the word for this, but I'm going to try on some things. Is there an element of, let's say, familial culture or parenting or the experiences and the way that the children are learn how to handle experiences that's being investigated as well? That doesn't, because when I think about environment, I mean, that might be thrown in the bag with environments, but when I think of environment, I'm thinking more of like specific toxins that are present.
Right, molecular kind of stuff, and
Yeah.
yeah. I don't know to what extent that has been studied. I will say, just simply because there is autism, the family does not mean that that family is also not dysfunctional, which can lead towards other compounding issues, maybe like personality disorders and other anxiety disorders and depression that maybe wouldn't have been there or as significant of a factor for that individual had they been raised in a healthier environment psychologically.
It's just
So
so hard to keep tabs on that. I feel like it's the elephant in the room. That it's so
yeah,
difficult to know what happens in a person's
yeah.
life. It's so winding and complex.
I mean, honestly, PTSD, complex PTSD, are certainly co-occurring with autism for a variety of different conditions.
Hmm.
Some of it may be family of origin effects, living in either a physically, sexually, emotionally abusive home. Like I say, just because the family has autism doesn't mean they're not going to be prone to those sorts of things as well. Um, I don't know if they would be more or less prone. That's kind of hard to say. I don't honestly know if that has been looked at yet. So I could see it going either way. I could see subsets where they may be disinclined to be abusive because of some of the features of autism, where they also tend to be disinclined to be violent. But that doesn't mean that there are absolutely no violent people who are on the autism spectrum.
Or parents, right? The parents could react to this with frustration or with compassion. Like, you just can't
Yeah.
predict that.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard being a parent, period, right? That is one of the most challenging things one will ever do. It takes so much of your energy and so much of your time. It can simultaneously be the most rewarding thing that you do. But then to add on top, to have a child who struggles with communication to communicate what their needs are, that's inevitably going to be frustrating for both parties. The parent doesn't know how to help the child doesn't know how to communicate their needs in order to help themselves. And so that's gonna probably create problems for families. Which is understandable. In many ways, I certainly support a lot of the tenets of things like neurodiversity. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that everything is just rainbows and roses, right? And it's not always specifically a social model of disability strictly. That can definitely be a major part of it. where how society chooses to interact with the autistic person can be abusive or negative or whatever, right? And lend towards some of that disability. But there's plenty of features that people with autism struggle with that is going to be usually, regardless of what the environment is like. Just example like sensory issues, that can be a major struggle. It can get worse if the environment's not supportive, but it can nevertheless be a major struggle no matter what kind of environment that individual is in.
I
And
think
even
this is the modern medical paradigm, though. This is the revolution we're going through. It's like like there was a lot of promise with the simplistic, one germ, one disease, or one gene, one disorder. It would be so nice if biology just worked like that. But I think it's becoming increasingly untenable, and I think that the medical apparatus is struggling to figure out how to adapt to that new knowledge base.
Yeah, it is challenging. And then, of course, well, at least in this country, struggling with capitalism on top of that, and just slowly kind of decreasing healthcare availability. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like it's just getting worse, even for people who aren't on the spectrum, or who don't have any of these other related health issues.
Well, it's a feedback loop because it's much better for a capitalist medical system to sell treatments, right, that are specific to a disorder, and it's much easier for the practitioners that way. And people want it. Like, they want a pill to make them lose weight. Like, they don't want to have to go to the gym and stuff, right? So people want that magic bullet, and it's this self-reinforcing feedback loop.
Yep. Yeah, it very much is. And with something like autism that is so variable, right? Not just person to person, but even day to day, individuals on the spectrum can struggle with something one day, and the next day, maybe it's not such a big issue, and it can really just, flare and fluctuate. That's really hard for a physician sometimes to get their mind around, especially if they are not either an individual on the spectrum or a stakeholder who's close to somebody on the spectrum. I think it does make a big difference for a lot of physicians who have a passion for working with a given population, especially if they themselves have been through it, or they've got a really close family member and they've seen the challenges, the struggles, the abilities, the disabilities, all of that. I think it makes a big difference. And I'm actually along those lines. I'm just was finishing off an epilogue for a book that I'm editing today, on Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or connective tissue related disorders, and neurodiversity. And basically concluding with this idea of um, kind of putting out this call for people on those spectrums, if they're willing and able, to step up and become those clinicians, become those scientists, because we are seeing more people doing that, and we're seeing more and more really stellar work or treatment interventions, or just plain support coming from those individuals. I think because there's no challenge with empathy there, right? The closer your lived experience is as either a physician or some kind of clinician or a scientist to the individuals you're studying or trying to treat, it's just less challenging to put yourself into that other individual's shoes, because you've sort of been there for some stuff. And I really hope we see more of that. We're seeing more of that with with the Ehlers-Danlos, and we're seeing, for those who are not too disabled by their physical ailments, to go to school and to get training in those areas and become the change that we want to see in healthcare, in science, for those different communities. I think it's a great way to go. As an example, one of my co-authors on this edited book Courtney Gensimer. She's a postdoc over at MUSC. She has Ehlers-Danlos. She basically got her PhD mentor into it, and he was willing to do it, and she wanted to study it. And they were able to accommodate her needs because it wasn't always feasible. She's had a number of surgeries and things like that. And they've recently put out a preprint about discovering a gene that seems to be associated with hypermobile EDS. Now, not all cases. It's undoubtedly going to be very complex, and probably a lot of different genetic variants are going to be associated with it. But this is a step, and she's a fantastic patient scientist. And so I look forward to more people stepping into those kind of roles. In my own life, I'm on both of these spectrums, and some of our recent work on autism genetics and the Neanderthal genome. It was part of my long interest in just wanting to understand at least part of the genetic side of autism. As well as my longstanding interest in paleontology and paleoanthropology, at least from a hobby perspective. So I look forward to seeing more patient scientists and patient clinicians get into these fields. I think it's going to be great. So,
Do you think that there is going to be a change in the way that the spectrum for autism is defined as research into the genetics becomes more developed? Because it seems like from the papers that I've read that the genetic linkage is not always very clear. And
oh
from
yeah,
everything that I've seen about autism, it's also that the manifestation of autism is also very different from patient to patient.
yeah, yeah.
And so it seems like it's this enormous umbrella that's being used right now to encompass a
Yeah,
tremendous number of different
yeah. They're
experiences.
very, very extraordinarily heterogeneous. It won't, like the old saying, when you met one person with autism, you only met one person with autism, right? I tend to think of them, at least from the genetic side, more in grouped in families, which is still not a guarantee that the same, susceptibility variants are going to be, playing throughout the family. It may be more complicated, but I have noticed that the diagnostic spectrum seems to continue to expand. I think clinicians are identifying people who are more high masking. They're getting better at that. There is definitely, we've also gotten better at identifying people who are more on what they would now call the profound end. I'm not overly thrilled with that term, merely because it can get mixed up with terminology with intellectual disability. I don't feel like it's clear enough. But certainly, you have a spectrum at the very least of intellectual ability. You have some folks that are in that very severe end that are have major problems with communication, are have major sensory issues, are self-harming to the point maybe the families are needing to constantly put on headgear for them. It can be very challenging for for a lot of those families. At the very least, your child who seems to be unhappy and uncomfortable, right, in their own body, and has a real challenge with communicating their needs. I think that's a big key. It's hard to be happy when you have such challenges communicating your needs to get your needs met, because we're, to a certain extent, we're always going to be somewhat dependent on people around us. And that's not to say that that does not affect people who are also high masking. It's hard to it's harder and harder to think of the spectrum as a single line of severity. It's way more nuanced than that,
And so what's the conception that you have of it, as opposed to it being a linear
you know,
spectrum? With
I am looking at it more and more. In terms of the way that I used to think, and I still do, I used to think about intellectual disability, right? We would normally think about it as, well, this is kind of the end feature, right? This individual has major adaptive challenges. And when you test them with whatever, test you're using, whether it's a, WACE or Stanford Binet or whatever, they're testing in this range, right? There are many, many, many different types of intellectual disability, hundreds, if not, thousands at this rate. So I'm okay with grasping that as intellectual disability, quote unquote, and while still understanding that they're technically different conditions from person to person. I tend to view autism nowadays much more like that. I think it's easier than trying to think of it as a single thing. I still think probably there is a core issue or group of issues that's occurring within the brain. There are a number of systems that seem to maybe not be working as well as they ought to. Some of them, probably some of the long range communication in the brain, especially across that corpus callosum. You can see some of the same social issues arise in people who have agenesis of the corpus callosum. They don't necessarily have the repetitive stuff, but at least it's kind of showing you maybe some of this social stuff, maybe some of the language stuff is related to some of these major fibers. And no matter what happens, if those are targeted, you can develop these traits. Similar thing with some of the repetitive stuff. That's probably more along the lines of some of that communication between frontal cortex and the basal ganglia, which is trying to regulate, basically at its simplest form, stop and go. And sometimes whether that's repetitive mannerisms or even just repetitive thoughts that don't, they have a hard time getting under control. That still kind of falls under that system. So
Are those part of the key criteria for the diagnosis of autism?
as
Yeah, I
far
was
as
gonna ask.
the outer, the outward traits, yeah. So
Like, what does it mean to have? I guess probably should have asked this earlier, but like, what is autism? I know.
what is autism? So
You know it when you see it.
It's going to be one of those simplistic, probably too simplistic definitions, right? But that's the nature of all criteria, I guess, when trying to summarize a complex condition that is so heterogeneous. But you're going to see challenges with social communication. That's going to be really variable. It may be all the way to the point that person is not able to verbally communicate, and maybe they can't even communicate with assisted communication devices. It's going to vary all the way up to, the individual who, I mean, even some individuals that you see on TikTok nowadays who maybe you would never guess that that person is on the spectrum because they are so high masking. But once they finally come home and take that mask off, you see the amount of wear that has taken on them. It's a huge range, right? So the other core part of the condition is the repetitive restrictive behaviors. That can be some of the stimming. That can be stuff like lining cars up in rows. That can be, a lot of stuff
What's
that you
stimming?
might.
Sorry.
So stimming is stereotypic movements. You might see, individuals who are hand flapping, rocking. It's not particular to autism. You can see stimming in a variety of conditions, like ADHD. That's also very common in ADHD. Sometimes the types of stims can differ. In autism, maybe you will see some effects of, if this person is not that socially aware, they're not going to alter their stims to something that is socially quote unquote appropriate, right? Whereas, individuals who are perhaps more aware, maybe they're going to shift that into something that is much more socially okay, like knee bobbing or fidgeting with things, or so it can really, really vary. But in general, a lot of times it's a good way to kind of get energy out, right? A lot of times you might see it as an adaptive function to anxiety, or just being upset or really excited. It's almost like I kind of think of it, as the way the locomotive blows out the steam, right, without busting the engine. That's not the case for all, right, but that is a very common theme that we see with folks on the spectrum, and it's a good way for them to help regulate their autonomic nervous system to kind of let off some of that energy, so that it's not getting bottled up and they don't explode in some other way that is more unhealthy. So, there is a bit of a movement I've noticed in, coming to accept not just stems from, people on the autism spectrum, but, any kind of neurodivergent condition, where it helps that person to adapt and be more functional within their daily lives, and kind of get rid of some of that energy.
All right, so you have an interesting suspicion that the roots of autism go really far back.
Yeah, definitely. First off, it's complicated. Anything autism genetics is always going to be complicated. So I always like to say, kind of as as an aside before I go into anything like this,
Disclaimer.
yeah, my disclaimer, right? Like, anybody who comes up to you and says, I have found the cause, smile at them and then, kind of, that's right. Okay. Very nice. Because it is insanely complex. It's insanely complex, even in the conditions that have intellectual disability, which is usually more often where we see major mutations, rare mutations that we're definitely not seeing in non-autistic people for the most part. So even those are complex. We see more than 300 plus major effect genes that at a very high rate tend to be associated with autism. That's the simplest genetic version. Those tend to be the ones that I study because it's a little easier. And then there's probably thousands more genes that are involved in various ways. So it's complex. So that's my disclaimer. Okay, with that said, I have done some research looking at the evolution of these major effect autism genes. And so I published this, I think it was last summer at this rate. And one of the major things that I found was that in looking at when these genes evolved, when did they first pop into existence? A lot of them associated with autism seem to have evolved, interestingly, during the Cambrian period, which that may sound familiar to some folks who are listening to this, but associated with like the Cambrian explosion and all the weird animals and sea creatures and stuff like that, and
Autistic algae.
Yeah, totally. So now that doesn't mean that they were in their present form, right? These genes have evolved dramatically since then. They tend to be, on average, very, very long. If you just look at the DNA sequence of these genes, they'll produce bigger proteins as well, which suggests that they're also probably a little bit more complicated. They're doing a variety of different things because they've got a bunch of different component parts, which also means you can mix and match and splice and stuff and do more stuff with that. But they tend to be very long. They have very, very long introns on average, which suggests that they have a lot of these what we would call regulatory sequences or non-coding sequences that are doing different things, probably for the most part for that gene they're contained in, and basically regulating it in a variety of ways. Like I said, you can produce a lot of different versions of a gene and a protein, the more regulatory sequences that you have. And so these are very, very big genes on average. They have, so they've clearly continued to evolve for a very long time, but probably more so in some of the regulatory sense, maybe not as much of the protein coding sequence, because they also tend to be really, really, really tightly conserved. The reason that is, on average, is because they're not only really important for the brain, they're also doing a bunch of other stuff throughout your body as well. And that has a tendency to kill you if you change it too much. So they don't like to change very much relative to other gene groups, like, say, compared to immune-related genes. Those evolve really rapidly, understandably, because it's an arms race against pathogens, right? So immune genes tend to evolve very rapidly. On the other end, you've got these autism genes and a lot of developmental regulatory genes that do not change a whole lot relative to the rest of the genome. They're very slow. So a lot of these, we're looking at probably about a quarter, maybe up over 30% of these major effect autism genes seem to have evolved during the Cambrian period. Now, one of the things that you might know about the Cambrian period is there's a whole bunch of animal variety that's suddenly popping into it. Well, not suddenly, but flourishing, right? You see a lot of different animal forms. Most of the stuff that you probably would be maybe a little bit more familiar with are some of the ones that are along the bug lineage, right? So you see a lot of these trilobites and anomalocaris and all these weird wacky things. The vertebrate lineage, our lineage, right, is AKA fish. They came into being in this period. And as boring as I used to think fish may have been, and nevertheless delicious, they're actually a really fascinating clade of vertebrates. They're the earliest vertebrates. You can use those in those days basically interchangeably. And they're also the first animals to have what we would call a true brain. Before that point, you did have animals that had centralized nervous systems. So it was something running usually sort of around the midline. So that would include all of those lovely little, trilobites and all those little bug relatives. But they don't actually have a brain, not in the sense of what we would define as a brain. Sometimes they do have ganglia, groups of cells that may be arranged in certain areas, maybe in the head region, but nothing that we would really call a brain. So what we call a brain is, from a biological perspective, it has three major components in order to be considered a true brain. It has a forebrain, midbrain, and a hindbrain. And this was something that suddenly, presumably, came into being in some of those earliest fishes. We know that because we can see true brains in the modern day hagfish and lampreys that are, granted, they've gone through a lot of evolution since 500 million years, but they are the modern day descendants, the last ones left of the jawless fish. Those were essentially the earliest fish. So they didn't have a bottom jaw. You can imagine they weren't really voracious predators by that point. So
Bottom feeders.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, some of them look like they're pretty vampiric nowadays, but I'm not saying they didn't predate, but
just sort of hoovering up things.
Yeah, well, that hagfish, I don't know. It's got some interesting. I'll have to show you at some point, but it's got some interesting teeth.
And lampreys too. They basically have this giant maw.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, giant. They have a maw filled with
relatively.
teeth to latch onto something.
And they also are really gross in terms of I think they produce this sludge or something. I'm sure any of the ichthyologists can correct me on my terminology. So.
Oh wow! I just looked at this thing's mouth.
Yeah, you looked up the mouth.
God. Yeah. We might have to show this to people.
Yeah. So they have a forebrain, right? And so that stuff that we would think of, at least in humans, that's the biggest part of our brain, right? Along with stuff like the hippocampus, that's really important for memory and other things like that. And they have a midbrain, which interestingly enough is a lot more important in fish than it tends to be for us. It does a lot of stuff in terms of visual processing and auditory processing. And then they have a hindbrain. They don't yet. Yeah, there you go. That's a beautiful creature right there. Yeah.
That is something else.
There's your hagfish. Now apparently his lineage lost a skull. He used to have a cranium. It looks a little different in these fish, but at least it's slightly protective of this beautiful new brain that they had developed. But it's a little hodgepodge, and they also apparently lost a vertebral column, but lampreys still have it. And so I get to torture my students in my brain evolution class with these fish. They're they never thought they were going to go there, but they're really fascinating because one of the things that happened Aside from, what we see physically with this, basically this evolution of a true brain, um, genetically around this time in some of the, these earliest stages of fish development, of vertebrate development, we see two whole genome duplications, which is exactly what it sounds like. The genome duplicated once and then duplicated again. So you have a massive amount of new genetic material. So one of the interesting things that happens oftentimes with whole genome duplications is over time, stuff you don't really need tends to get deleted just by sheer chance, because deletions happen all the time in genomes. When they're really bad, they're not passed down, or you don't even make the organism in the first place, right? But when it's not that bad, it can get passed down. And so you end up deleting a lot of these genes that are more flexible. A lot of these genes are metabolic in origin, which is usually most likely why we see in humans a lot of metabolic diseases. In order to develop it, have to be recessive, and I'm talking rare stuff, not like diabetes, metabolic disease, but metabolic diseases in the rare sense. And usually what we would call inborn errors of metabolism. All right. And so a lot of these, not all, but a lot of them are recessive, which means you got to inherit two bum copies in order to develop this condition. Now, that's really bad when that happens, but it also means that these genes are a little bit more flexible. It means you can literally lose a copy and it probably won't kill you. Right. Which is saying something. That's actually really impressive that you could lose a whole gene, one copy of your gene, and it's not that bad. On the other hand, developmental genes, that's bad. That will usually kill you. Even small changes to the dosage of a gene, whether it produces a little bit more or a little bit less, even that can sometimes be deadly or extremely impairing. So you can see why the conservation of those genes in particular is really tight. So we've had these two whole genome duplications. So guess which genes we hold on to? It's the developmental genes, because it's more about the relative dosage of those genes to the partners they interact with. Usually this is it's more about the networks that they take part in. Sometimes it might be a protein complex that they form with other proteins. Sometimes it may be more of a pathway. Either way, there's not a lot of wiggle room. They're okay if you duplicate it entirely. That's totally fine within reason. But you can't then start taking those genes away, because you're going to screw up that duplicated pathway or that duplicated complex. So usually what we see when we have whole genome duplications, those types of genes tend to be held on to preferentially. So that's most likely why we see these genes suddenly evolve in this early vertebrate lineage that are associated with autism. It doesn't necessarily mean that they popped out of nowhere, or you suddenly turned what was not, coding sequence suddenly into coding sequence, but that they're probably duplicates of even older genes that have continued to be tweaked because they were extra copies. And we tend to give them a different name because we're humans and we like to name everything uniquely, like Sonic Hedgehog, for example.
Which is a
Um,
developmental, it's a developmental
which is
Hox gene.
yeah, it's really important in pretty much everything. It does a lot of stuff.
Also, an awesome video game from the 1990s.
Yeah, again,
But
totally
so
awesome.
it's like the causal relationship here is a little bit tricky to tease apart, right? Because if the gene appears and the gene is vital for the proper development of the organism,
Yeah.
then later disorders of that gene are, it's not that there's some kind of, proto-autism appearing in the lampreys and the hagfish.
Right.
It's more that there is now this system that in different organisms, once perturbed due to its centrality, will cause a variety of downstream
screw it up.
catastrophic effects.
Yeah. And sometimes really catastrophic, to the point you may have really severe intellectual disability and maybe other physical manifestations in other organs. That's why usually with these major effect genes, you're going to see them associated more often with that other side of the spectrum. But that doesn't mean that necessarily smaller, less effective mutations in those same genes might not be playing a role in a wider variety of autism. So, or those pathways. Right. So, it's a lot of different pathways. A lot of them are associated with growth and development. I like to say in general, they're really important for timing. Especially in the brain, you can screw that up really easily. The timing, it is just this massively coordinated dance. If you don't have it right, you can have cells that don't end up in the wrong place. Maybe they don't end up fully maturing and differentiating. Maybe it affects how far their branches are. Maybe they're not even able to manage to form the corpus callosum and reach across, for whatever reason. So it's really variable. I think some of what we're seeing and learning more about what's actually going on that's conserved between the lamprey brain and our own brains. And granted, there's certain presumptions about that. There's a lot of evolutionary history that's taken part, but I think that there are aspects of brain evolution that we see sort of recapitulated in autism in the sense that we've created these new genes. For a while, they're going to be closely related in function to their parental genes and their parental networks. But over time, that is within reason is going to be tweaked, right? Because you just don't necessarily need that many copies, right? But it gives you an opportunity to play with evolution a little bit, very slowly, but play with it. And I think what we're honestly seeing is the creation probably of new areas of the brain and even new neuron types. Neurons know exactly where they are in the brain, just like every other cell in your body. They have a very good molecular spatial awareness, just because, for instance, one epithelial cell looks like the next epithelial cell to us does not mean that they don't have their unique identities and their own unique locations and functions. The brain, even more so. One neuron, just because it looks like a neuron from the frontal cortex, does not equate it to a neuron in the occipital lobe in the visual cortex. So I think some of what we're seeing is the creation of new regions of the brain. And what's important there is the developmental timing. Evolution likes to tweak brain cells and their development in terms of timing. You can basically turn it into different types of cells in different locations or ending up in different locations. And I think that's some of what we're seeing. Probably what we are seeing in a variety of neurodevelopmental conditions, autism and maybe some others, is even though if that person passed away and you took histology and did neuropathology on their brain, right, and took a variety of different sections, maybe it wouldn't look that different, or maybe it would look very subtly different. But I think some of what may differ are some of the identities of the cells. That spatial awareness of where those neurons are in space and time and how they're supposed to be functioning.
What leads you to think that?
Mainly because a lot of their identities are about timing. If they don't develop in a certain location at a certain rate and then migrate usually to a certain location, they're not going to form connections properly. You may lose cells along the way. For instance, there's a lot of inhibitory cells. I always feel so badly for them because they've got to travel from the underside of the brain, what we call the ventral region. Usually they've got to travel all the way up into the cortex. It's a massive trajectory for a tiny little microscopic cell. That doesn't always happen properly. There's a lot of stuff you can imagine if the timing is slightly off that you may lose cells. We see that with genetics. We see it with environmental exposures like maternal stress. They've done that on, I think it was out of the Yale study group a number of years ago. They had done some animal models of restraint stress on, I think it was mice. And they looked at the longer that restraint went on at key periods of development. How many of those interneurons, those inhibitory cells, didn't manage to make it? And the more extreme the stress, the fewer of them managed to actually get up into the cortex.
And that's post-birth development, or that's...
So you're talking pre-birth. So that would be pre-birth. That also doesn't necessarily mean that all of it is retained, is occurring prenatally. Much of it will be, though. That is kind of one general factor we see with autism on average. Now that does not mean, though, that there may not be other effects that may worsen an individual's condition. For instance, or even make them susceptible in the first place. So, for instance, we do know that being an extreme preemie increases the likelihood. And from what I understand, they've been able to, with controlling other factors, it seems to be associated with the brain bleeds that are much more likely with extreme prematurity. So actually, brain damage can influence the likelihood that autism may occur, or intellectual disability, or other conditions. So but for the most part, when we're looking at the genetics of autism, there are several major functional trends that we see of these major effect genes. Probably the biggest trend is, in terms of function, is genes that are epigenetic regulators. So they control the timing of other events. They control whether other genes will turn off or on. A lot of those are transcription factors. Some of them may affect methylation. There's a whole variety of different stuff. Another big subgroup are genes that are associated with the synapse. So now some of those also are involved in other functions. So it's not always necessarily just synaptic communication, that point where both of the neurons are meeting and communicating with each other. But so those are some of the major subgroups that we see in terms of these major effect genes, if you had to put them into a big functional group. So, but especially with the ones that are epigenetic regulators, timing. It's all about timing.
Hey folks, real quick interruption. If you were listening to this podcast and you are enjoying it, and you've listened to a bunch of our other podcasts and you have enjoyed them, consider coming over to patreon.com or sending us a donation through PayPal or whatever other means that you have available to you. We are a purely listener-supported podcast, and we want to be able to continue doing that, and so we need your help. Come on over to patreon.com or any of the donation links down below, and hopefully we'll see you there. How much of autism can be related directly to genetic causes? Because everything that I've read seems to suggest that it varies wildly, where some cases are up to 90% and some cases seem to have no genetic link at all.
It's funny because you read the Wikipedia page and at the top of it, it's like autism can generally be considered a high heredity disease. And then the further you read down on it, the less confident you are in that initial statement.
It's varied by the type of study. So some of the 60 to 90% stuff are the twin studies, right? And so I think the 60% stuff tends to be associated more with twins, monozygotic or identical twins who have complete agreement, complete concordance on the specific diagnosis. Now that's obviously changed now. This is back in the day when there was autistic disorder and Asperger's and PDD, NOS, and so there were a bit of a hodgepodge of different labels. And so the 60% was when the exact label was identical, whereas the 90% was they were both somewhere on the autism spectrum, but the label maybe varied.
But even 90 is bizarre for monozygotic twins, right? You would expect something, if it was like eye color or something, right? You would expect it to be 100 or very, very close.
Yeah. And I mean, again, that's one of those things when it comes to brain development, even though they're both sharing the same womb, it can vary a little bit as to whether they're sharing identical environments, but then a lot of times you also have competition.
Who got the really nice seat in the womb?
Yeah. Yeah. So probably some of that is that effect. Because we do know, like, for instance, nutrition can definitely affect susceptibility to autism, like folate deficiency, and I'm sure a wide variety of different things. So, so it's just because they were, just because they were housed together didn't mean that they got all the same stuff. So then, on top of that, there may be different effects in terms of location, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's effects even with maternal infection, and again, who got the bigger
Oh, by
doses?
the way, speaking of housing together,
Yeah,
it occurs to me that with twins, they're raised really, really identically. Like their
yeah,
environment, their upbringing, all this is
yeah,
very, very. I'm
yeah.
not sure that they've done these separated at birth twin studies so much.
They've done a few, but it's like
Okay.
really, case by case, right? I think some of them, the ones they've been able to do, they are still able to see that a good portion, definitely the majority of whatever traits they're looking at that are more complex, still tend to be in agreement. Even if they were separated at birth and then raised separately. So there's still definitely a huge heritability factor for different aspects of personality traits and things like that. But again, just because they were housed together in the womb or even grew up in the womb, it's hard to say that it is genuinely identical. And I will also say that in terms of what, I don't know to what extent this has really been studied in autism per se, but definitely mosaic genomes, so cells that house slightly different versions of the genome. The brain tends to be a lot more mosaic on average than other organ systems. So presumably, even though identical twins received the same original genome, who knows what they've done differently with it, right? In terms of some of that mosaicism. So that may also vary more significantly too. So we may be seeing some of those factors play a role.
So do you think that there's a number that can be put on what percent of autism is genetically related, or you think that it's just too complex of a syndrome to be able to pin down like that?
Right. I mean, I think that number is invariably going to change based on how you study it. The twin studies gave one range of numbers. There tends to be a relatively decent agreement, even when you're looking at some of the other studies have looked at potential genetic underpinning in conditions where, for the most part, we've tended to weed out the single gene conditions that, the ones that are associated with a lot of those major effect genes and may also have intellectual disability and more severe effects to the person in general. But even common variants, common polygenic background variants, you're still probably looking around about 50%. So they tend to do 50 to 60%, and then 50 to 40% environment. So it always consistently seems to be kind of halvesies. So
Mm.
and again, I think that's pretty spot on for a condition that is complex, in the sense that it has so many different potential causes, um, be it genetic and or environmental. I think again, the majority of folks are probably going to see that there is most certainly a genetic underpinning. Um, the other question, though, is just because genetics is playing a significant role, does that mean that, hey, I inherited this suite of different gene variants? Am I definitely going to get autism? Usually the answer is probably not no. Then you're dealing with another percentage. So even the major effect genes, targeting them, they have a wide range of penetrance for the autism phenotype. You may be 10 to 20%, like with Down syndrome. And of course, you're not talking about a single gene there, obviously. But usually, I think if I recall, it's like about 12 to 15% of folks with Downs also have autism. So that would, especially the DYRK1A gene, which is one of the major targets in Downs and seems to be associated with the autism phenotype as well. That is considered a major effect gene. But again, 10 to 20%, right? Versus some other conditions that there's not too many of them that are almost at 100. There's a few that'll either lead to either full-on autism or some significant autism symptoms. Maybe they're not quite making cutoff. Again, sometimes it's hard to differentiate the intellectual disability in those individuals from the autism. It just makes it more complicated. But there's a range, right? Fragile X, you're looking at maybe 40 to 50% have autism. So even the ones that are like highly penetrant are not usually 100% penetrant.
It's really interesting to me because there seems to be some debate, at least in the popular media sphere, about, is autism environmental, is it genetic? But it seems like one can't live without the other in some sense, because even the people who are like, it's caused by this, that, or the other thing, in the environment, let's say, just to keep it clean, it's still on them to explain why it doesn't affect everyone who's exposed to those environmental whatevers. Yeah. And so it seems like
there has to be another factor, and those same people will often decry the possibility that there's a genetic basis for it.
Yeah.
And this is often been the case that we've discovered. Shiloh and I spent a lot of time kind of trolling the scientific fringe when we were in grad school. We kind of started a hobby where we would go find people with extreme theories and then see how we could take the presentations apart. It was kind of an epistemic game of, okay, this person's making a claim that at first glance looks robust.
Right.
Or at the very least, they have a vast body of work that makes the claim. And then you start to dig down to it and you see that the assumptions fall apart at some place. And it's always interesting to see how quickly you can identify that place.
Yep.
And with the autism as pure environment, it seems to fall apart exactly at the place where it's like, well, hold on a second. If it's environment alone and everyone is exposed to this environmental factor, then you'd expect it to be at almost 100% prevalence in the population.
Right. And there's, I am not aware of many environmental factors that would fill that niche, right? Like I said, there's not many genes that do the same thing in the reverse, right? So it's always going to be complicated. So it is hard to put a percentage. Everybody's going to be a little different, right? Some people maybe have a much bigger genetic component, and maybe some, regardless of what the environment was going to be like, that person was going to be somewhere on the spectrum, right? Alternatively, there may be people who still have a genetic component, maybe alone, that was not going to lend towards autism, but with some of those additional environmental stressors like maternal infection during pregnancy, et cetera, then that pushes it over, right? So, it's I know everybody wants a simple answer, but it's the old nature versus nurture, and you just got to remove the verses. It's all biology, and the biology is part of the environment. And, and that's just kind of, it's really hard to separate environment from the biology, right? I mean, we eat stuff, we do not function without it. You breathe oxygen, you do not work without it. It's, there's just so many places where that boundary is so blurred. And like you say, it's really, it's more of a human concept in order to try and simplify something that is just going to evade that simplicity. Everybody's going to be a bit different.
So I know that I really want to get to the Neanderthal link, but something that I wanted to ask earlier is how good are we at identifying genetic causes of other psychiatric conditions? Is this kind of a general thematic issue?
Yeah, we generally suck at it.
Okay.
I mean, it will get better as our processing power improves. It's really hard to process that much information and those many relationships at one time. And that's just the genome, right? Much less trying to move that up the line to the cell level, the tissue level, the organ level, the human level. And so any of these conditions that are ridiculously complex, like autism, like schizophrenia, like bipolar, like depression, like anxiety, all of those, like Alzheimer's, you know, everybody's going to be a bit different. The symptomatology may be some of the common features. When you're up at that higher systems level, it seems to converge back. There's still going to be variation, obviously. But when you go down to the molecular level, there's going to be a lot of variety, which is the basic equation I tend to use is if the condition occurs in more than 1% of the population or around that, that is a common condition. That's going to be a complex condition. There's going to be a whole bunch of different causes, different factors that are going to play a role in that. On the one end, you're probably going to have some people who are maybe they have a more extreme expression. Like with autism, we see the more extreme in terms of association with intellectual disability. People with ID and autism are much more likely to have an obvious rare genetic component that was a big blow, right? Like a gene just got deleted or something like that, right? Something usually loss of function or really bad gain of function, either way.
And I mean,
And
inherently that makes sense, right? Like we're comfortable with convergent evolution where you see these molecular pathways in different lineages that converge on performing the same function in a
Yep.
similar way, despite the fact that they branched, well before that gene was ever evolved. And
Yeah.
so it makes perfect sense that when you have something that's a complex collection of symptoms, that it would also be the same phenomenon of convergence where pathways break, but there's only so many ways in which they can break that don't
Right.
kill you.
Right.
And so all of a sudden you have this thing that looks like one grouping, but in reality it dissipates into a million different ones. I think cancer is kind of similar.
Yeah, I think you see again enough that you can have an overlapping umbrella term like cancer, but then it's very different at the specific cell and even genome level within the same types of cancer. So and it's there's going to be blurry points where maybe that big umbrella term stops working, and especially the closer in you go. But the further out you go, it's more like a Seurat painting, right? It works. The label works at the high systems level, and that's pretty typical of a lot of complex diseases. So
I like that.
I mean, speaking about complex, it seems like biology is one of those things where as soon as we get a nice, streamlined understanding of how things work, even when I was a kid coming up, it was pretty standardized, like genes encode, DNA encodes, RNA encodes, proteins, right? And it quickly becomes something not so simple. And evolution seems to be one of those things as well, where you have this beautiful, simplistic, I mean, I don't want to call Darwin's idea simplistic. It's a big book, but
yeah,
right. It's a pretty streamlined idea. You can understand, you can teach it to high school kids. It's not a big deal. But then we start thinking about things like punctuated equilibrium and hybridization, which is crazy. That's something we don't talk about a lot. And one of the things that when I look back into the history of humanity, and I think about this time where there's multiple different types of hominids on the planet. And that's a really weird moment for me because I'm like, and then we get this picture that humans have somehow mated with another species, this Neanderthal hypothesis, this hybridization hypothesis. And that's really weird because, I mean, imagining humans mating with another species today is a bit more far-fetched. But it seems to have been a thing that's happened in the past.
Yeah, I mean, even if you think about it, just 50,000 years ago, there were at least, 4 of us around, right?
That's
Maybe we
crazy.
weren't always running into each other, but, I mean, there's a few of them that may have been more island associated, but nevertheless,
Is this just a problem with the word species? I mean,
yeah, I think it's a continual issue. I mean, hybridization always throws, especially, one of probably the best definitions we've had for species, which of course has varied for a long time. People, they just will continue to argue. They have always argued, and they will continue to argue, right? And usually most biologists will use well, can they successfully intermix, right? Now there's a whole bunch of things that can cause problems. Maybe they're not on the same continent. That one I almost kind of say like, well, I'm not in Africa, but I could sure, intermix with people in Africa. So what does that have to do with it? But anyways,
Well, there's
yeah,
a
I
huge
think,
controversy out here right now because in the Pacific Northwest, there was a really big push to conserve the great spotted owl in the 90s.
mm,
And so
mhm,
that's a
mhm,
huge link for why they curtailed logging, and
yeah,
there's a lot of national forest land that was protected. And
mhm,
now there's an owl that's coming from the East Coast
mhm,
that can intermix with the great spotted owl. And everybody's freaking out. And they're like, well, the spotted owl is endangered. And so we have to protect the spotted owl. But there's this other, I think it's the barred owl that's coming
mhm,
over. And the barred
mhm,
owl can mix with the spotted owl and make something that kind of looks like the spotted owl.
right,
And the conservationists have no idea what to do because technically this would save the spotted owl
yeah,
because there's this new creature that can protect the species and allow them to develop. But
right,
this idea of this species as an immutable category that must be protected in its current form just creates existential panic when people really start to play with the idea of what does it mean to preserve a
yeah,
species in
yeah.
biological time.
It really does. I mean, on some level, each new biological organism is a unique entity, right? That's probably the only place that does not fall apart, is to just avoid the species level and just talk about the individual organisms, right? But even there, like we've got a microbiome and there's, not always a separation. But, I think I'm coming to the conclusion it's really more of a philosophical debate than
Mm.
anything biological, because if it's not genuinely reflected in the reality, then clearly something's wrong with our Campbell soup label of a species. And which is okay. I mean, words are imperfect, representations of reality.
And
They're,
also the genetic components. We've
yeah,
sequenced like less than 0.2% of
yeah,
the species on Earth. And I don't know if you followed what happened in the mycology community when people started sequencing mushrooms.
uh-huh,
And every single classification started to fall apart because always mushrooms were characterized by their physical characteristics,
right.
where you have gills, you have veils, you have the tube mushrooms, and
Hmm.
all of a sudden they start sequencing them, and they're like, holy shit, they're not at all
What you thought?
aligned by these characteristics, and you can
Wow.
have mushrooms that are very closely related that
Yeah.
look that break
Complete.
these traditional characteristics. And so now the mycology community is in complete crisis because they're trying to figure out, well, what does this mean? How do we categorize things? How do we actually understand the relationship between these things?
Blows Linnaeus out of the water or something.
Yeah. And it's just, I think that that's the great uh, complication that we're going to end up having to confront over and over again,
Yeah.
which is that
Yeah.
as our genetic sequencing tools become more and more advanced and we have the money to actually assemble genomes of more species, we're going to start
Mhm.
to discover that our superficial labeling is just that.
Yeah. Yeah. And our conceptions of how that works. I mean, I think there was a paper within the last couple of weeks that came out, showing that in all likelihood, a subset of what we thought was Neanderthal derived DNA in sub-Saharan African people, was from an earlier, hybridization, where Africans, from earlier migrations out, had intermixed with Neanderthals, and Neanderthals had retained some of that DNA. So it looked like Neanderthal DNA, but the sub Saharan Africans actually have that because they originally had it. So
Mm.
Yeah, I was gonna ask,
um,
like, how do they separate out common ancestor from?
it is challenging. It is, as I gather, now granted, I'm not one of the individuals working on this. But it is complicated. How do you, one of the big issues is how do you differentiate between this hybridization versus something called incomplete lineage sorting, which is basically as populations split up and migrate, not all variants are represented equally across those populations. So, some of what we think might be Neanderthal could actually just be from a subset population. It really wasn't because of hybridization. So it gets complicated. I think once you get to, once you sequence everybody on Earth, it might get a little easier. But and then this other new issue of how much did we give to them? Did they give back to us, or they didn't give back to us? We had all along, and how many of those events? It looked like there were several, and it's we will always screw up these nice clean lines that we try to demarcate between in groups, whether that is the unfortunate Victorian science of race, right, or what we're dealing with now in modern conception of some of these other human cousins of ours. Honestly, I think probably the phrase you heard, kissing cousins, I think that's probably quite appropriate. And honestly, if people will intermix, if people can intermix, they will intermix. Yeah. So, and I think from this other article too, they were also stating that they also came to the conclusion that Neanderthal numbers were probably even smaller at that time, because it's usually based off the genetic variability that's contained within the genome as an estimate of population density.
Hmm.
And so that DNA that we subsequently gave to them a long time ago actually falsely inflated that heterogeneity. And so their numbers were probably even smaller. From what I recall, the authors concluded that it looks a little bit more likely that just by small numbers, they may have just ended up being subsumed into the larger Homo sapiens population, which has been an argument for some time. I'm sure there's examples where we tried to kill the crap out of each other, right? We're humans after all, right? We do that too. But as far as one species winning and the other not winning, I think that's very, Victorian gentleman science, and may not be terribly accurate. Crap happens in the environment. When you've got a small population, you're more likely to die out. So it may not have even been something like, hey, Homo sapiens were really so much better at this such and such skill and we outcompeted Neanderthals. It could have been as simple as we just had bigger numbers. So you could hurt us, but it wasn't going to, kill off the species.
There's a lot of luck involved in surviving.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, I know Stephen Jay Gould was really into the luck concept of stuff, and this concept also of volatility. The more, the more volatile the environment, the smaller the populations, the more likely that a given species will die out, and it is just sheer dumb luck, rather than better or worse. Sometimes it's just a population numbers kind of thing. So,
I mean, it still leaves open this question of like, if they're able to produce fertile offspring, were they really different species? And if they're not different species, then what are they?
Right. I think there could be arguments made on both, again, using our simplistic Campbell soup label of a species. At one point, knowing that they had intermixed, I was completely on the one side of the argument of, well, we really should be subspecies then, at least. And I know that was an argument for a long time, right? They didn't quite know what to do with them. If with some of the stuff that we're seeing in autism and maybe other associated conditions, if there is a subset of DNA that is kind of mismatched between the two genomes. So, like basically Neanderthal from the minor parent Neanderthal on the Homo sapiens background genome. If there's a mismatch, then I mean, I don't know. I'm almost kind of leaning in the middle of the other way as well. So, but again, I think at that point, that might not be the most interesting question because it's going to fall apart either way, right? It's clearly a label that's not going to suffice for this very unique, interesting, complex series of hybridizations, and what effect that has had on the hybrid species, which is us. I know there's definitely anthropologists that argue that we're not technically a hybrid species because it was to such a small extent. But I mean, even 30,000 years ago, we're looking at probably like 5 to 6% of the genome was still Neanderthal, and that there was probably maybe a 6 to 7 thousand year span in the 40+ thousand years ago that we were consistently intermixing. Probably, I would imagine, maybe in a single region like the Levant region, but I don't know. That's again, that's out of my field of expertise. Um, but it was certainly enough. It doesn't take very long to, if you just go even by halves, for your great, 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 great grandmother to suddenly only be a very small percentage of your DNA. And for the fact that pretty much everybody on Earth has some of that, that's pretty damned extensive. I don't know. Again, I'm not a mathematician, but it always seemed very unlikely to me that you could have that extent of introgression into the genome throughout the entire human race, and but that it only occasionally, the intermixing only occasionally happened. That just doesn't make any sense to me
Is the
mathematically.
intermixing value neutral in the genome in the sense that it's in all genes, or is it relegated to those that are strongly conserved?
Right. So quite the opposite. It's actually tends to be relegated to stuff that's not conserved. So basically, because it didn't screw stuff up, right? And so we see a lot more in things like metabolic genes, in immune genes. There's also part of me that wonders how, to what extent some of these immune variants that we receive from Neanderthals, whether they are truly adaptive or just like, hey, they didn't really matter that much, so we just held on to them, right? It didn't matter one way or another. And so it's just a sheer matter of probability. Because either way, you see what they call these selective sweeps of, sections of the genome that have more Neanderthal DNA and others where it's been weeded out. So again, any kind of hybridization event is going to tend to veer away from those developmental genes. That doesn't mean that there's not some Neanderthal variants in those genes. There definitely are. But if you just look at like the sheer amount, you're just going to see more in these other genes that don't really care too much one way or another, whether you hybridize and tweak. So, so that's definitely a pattern that is seen. I haven't studied pigment related genes. That's another one that tends to pop up with that. It's kind of like the trifecta of gene functions. It's immune, pigment, and metabolic that that we tend to see an increase in Neanderthal DNA. And I would imagine, probably given the trend, that it also they're more flexible, which suggests also that pigment is not a huge factor, especially probably once you're out of Africa and you're not under that massively hot sun in desert and grasslands. It's just not as important. I know there's been a lot of ideas about vitamin D and things like that. I will wait to be convinced on that one, given the trend that we see in the genetics already. But yeah, so those developmental genes, they don't like to change, whether it's hybridization or any other kind of mutation event. They're not big on it.
So, Neanderthals, were they autistic?
So that's a question I've been getting a lot lately. It's, of course, as with all things complicated. One, we'll never know. So so this is really more of a what if kind of scenario. Very recently they did find a Neanderthal inner ear fossil that is strongly suggestive that there was an individual with Down syndrome. So they definitely do have cases of Down syndrome, it seems. I would imagine a variety of anything else you're going to see in the general human condition. We haven't been separated that long. It's been well under 1 million years. So, and again, these developmental genes don't like to change that much. So, I would suspect that there probably was a subset that had autism. Some of them, we do know that, again, diet plays a role. And a lot of hunter-gatherer populations, they've had you can see in the enamel of their teeth that almost like you can read it in the rings of a tree. They went through frequent stress events growing up, right? And so suggesting that maybe their diets were not as consistent as they may have needed. So we may have seen more association with autism with dietary lack. On the other hand, they also had a much more limited intermixing population, right? So the Neanderthal population is very small. So stuff that if we see autism associated with any recessive conditions, you expect those recessive conditions to pop up more in those kind of populations. That goes for any kind of recessive condition, not just ones associated with autism. But in general, I get asked a question also, like, did we inherit autism from Neanderthals as well? And some of that, I think more of it is probably maybe some of the mismatch if we've inherited variants that aren't working as well on our Homo sapiens background. They may have worked fine in Neanderthals, right? But
Mm.
taken out of context, that might be where we see some of those. Bless you. Some of those issues.
I guess we
So
should preface this by saying that you published a paper where you found that some different variants were more common in people with autism from this
right.
Neanderthal lineage, right?
Right. Yeah. So we saw that especially rare Neanderthal variants, so stuff that doesn't crop up too often in non-autistic populations, those seem to be occurring more in autism. And usually with, from a genetics perspective, when looking at clinically related conditions, um, rare is usually the first one you go for, just because you don't need as big of an N, right? If it's rare in your non-autistic population and not rare in your autistic population, or whatever other conditions you're looking at. And so that's, so rather than looking at individual rare SNPs, so these single nucleotide polymorphisms, these little snippets in the DNA, rather than looking at them individually, which is a headache statistically, we basically grouped them together and looked at them en masse. So everybody kind of got a score, basically, of how many rare ones do you have versus, not. And that was one of the ways that we looked at that, in order to try and glean whether a lot of these rare DNA variants from Neanderthals might actually be playing a role. And so so far we have seen that association across the different ethnic groups that we studied. And these are very broad. White non-Hispanics, Black non-Hispanics, and white Hispanics. We were looking at databases that were available within the U.S. And so we still have additional things we want to do in order to tweak future experiments along these lines, because we've got a whole range of experiments we'd like to do. But yeah, we definitely saw this consistent signal in each of these different ethnically divided autism groups. It was obviously less in the Africans, or people of African descent, right? Because they on average they have lower amounts of Neanderthal DNA. But relative to other Black non-Hispanic individuals who don't have autism, they still also had this increase in rare variants. So
Do they also, is there also a correlation between just total amount of DNA that's coded as Neanderthal, or is
right.
that not the case?
We looked at that. We were seeing a little bit of a signal in that regard, in the white non-Hispanic, if I recall correctly. I hope I'm not forgetting my study. But it was in one of the groups. Now, I would say that probably that may have been more of one of the things that we need to fix in the next round, is to really try and get a better match for our controls and our autistic folks, because white Hispanic is huge, right? I mean, that's multiple continents of people, right? And you can imagine there's a lot of population variation. We tried as best we could to match that. We were selecting primarily individuals from within the US of Mexican, mostly Mexican, but also Puerto Rican descent. Those tend to be the two biggest Hispanic groups in the US. But I think probably some of the bigger differences we saw between those may actually be noise in there. So I will say there could be. I don't think so, but we're gonna have to continue to tweak our approach to that, and do some fancier admixture analyses to see, including even in our Black population. We There's traditionally a lot of admixture in Black Americans, and so our next thing is also to make sure that we're not seeing any of that signal associated with that, rather than the clinical association, right? So so there's a few things we're going to be able to do, and also using whole genome sequencing, because we were just looking at parts of the DNA that code for protein right now, which is a very small percentage of the total DNA. So we've got a lot more work to do on this. It's very promising right now. And there's obviously been a lot of interest in the topic, not so much because of me, but there have been other people who have suggested the association in the past. So, but
And what's your takeaway from it?
So, one, I need to work on my methodology as a scientist. I'm always looking forward to that next time of really, really, just getting rid of noise as best as possible. Because with genetics, that's always a challenge. But my takeaway is, I think in general, for as often as hybridization probably happens, and it's been underappreciated. I think we're slowly getting there, but it happens a lot more often in vertebrates than I think we thought. The plant community is like that. That was old news. We don't know what you're talking about. They've been up on hybridizations for decades, but this is still sort of new for everybody in the animal kingdom. So yeah, I think hybridization itself may be a potential susceptibility factor in a variety of different complex human conditions. I don't think it's just going to be autism. It's probably going to be a whole bunch of different stuff. Everything that's on that list. Probably going to be stuff like breast cancer and, all sorts of cancers and, different neurodegenerative diseases and, et cetera. A lot of neurodevelopmental stuff, pretty much heart disease, probably a lot of everything that affects a wide variety of people. And again, I think probably the majority of that is not going to be so much what is that specific DNA variant doing, but what is it doing or not doing on that background. That's always the classic challenge with genetics, is understanding how even just a single SNP, how that behaves in context. And sometimes it's the context of the genes, sometimes it's the context of things that are far more disparate and removed, which is really hard to glean. So again, I think as we get better processing power to deal with really, really large amounts of data and to look at more and more complex relationships, that will become easier. It is already, relatively speaking, but you still need a whole bunch of supercomputers to even work with that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be more of the mismatch issue, in terms of association with autism. So
Is there any thought that there was an adaptive element to it?
I think it, honestly, and this is just my personal, question is, originally I came to this wondering, yes, there are certain things about autism that can be impairing. Especially if you're just focusing solely on, hey, does this genetic variant get passed down to the next generation? We do
Right.
know that autistic people are less likely to have kids. There are still some who do, but it's reduced. That means that whatever genetic variants are associated with that condition are less likely to continue down. That doesn't mean that it might not be popping up in families and then passed down around that individual, but it's still going to decrease it a little bit. Again, that's why we're looking at some of the rare stuff. So, that acknowledged, my interest also was, hey, is it a coincidence that we intermixed with Neanderthals, at least the most recent time, 40, 50,000 years ago? And it was kind of around that time and after that we started seeing this kind of massive Renaissance cultural explosion in Homo sapiens within the archaeological record. And part of me genuinely wonders, one, there might be some variants that are kind of a double-edged sword. Maybe, yeah, they're more likely to cause autism, but maybe they're also involved in intelligence. We do see a lot of association with common genetic background, common variants that are implicated in both autism and high intelligence. But also, too, like with punctuated equilibrium, hybridization events are a destabilizing event. They're a potential trigger. So it may not even just be the variants that we literally inherited from them. The fact that we some of those variants may be mismatched can be a stimulus for further variation to be selected for in order to try and adapt to them, which in turn could have potentially led to some emergent properties. So I'm very interested in comparing what was the Homo sapien genome like before this, and then after. What are the ones that are literally derived from Neanderthals, but then what other genetic variants might have popped up and been selected for that have been part of that more complicated genetic picture? So again, punctuated equilibrium, a lot of these, it can be an environmentally destabilizing event, like a mass extinction, or it can be a hybridization event. Hybridization events, if they occur often enough, are often associated with some of these new leaps in speciation. So I kind of like to look at it as a potential stimulus as well. It may be more, I think it is more than just the Neanderthal DNA we inherited. I think it's probably a lot more than that. And we were certainly evolving alongside them, and had some unique features of our own. There's definitely no no arguing that. We were an unusual species even for a human species. But I think that probably that long series of hybridization may have been an important stimulus in our own evolution down the line, which I think is more of the story of all of us, not just about autism, right? So I'm very interested in that from a human evolution perspective as well, especially somebody who's really interested in the brain as a neuroscientist. So
Well,
I
I mean,
find
like
that.
one thing that's really what's really endlessly fascinating to me is the future evolution of human beings, right? We always talk about evolution as being this thing that happens in the past, but
Yeah.
I'm always, I mean, it's hard for me to imagine that things just stand still from now on,
Oh, yeah. I
right?
mean, the larger size of our intermixing population will make that appear to happen for a while. Population size plays a big role in homogenizing. So the more that we continue to intermix across the world over, maybe occasionally we may see some mismatch variants. Again, not that it's a hybridization, because it's not species to species, but even within our own species, where let's say we've got two individuals that are coming together that maybe ancestrally they're separated by 20,000 years, right? They're going to have some slight differences in genetics. Maybe occasionally some of those might not be matched very well, and you may end up popping up with issues like autism. But also, obviously, you've got it on the other hand where you don't want to be marrying your cousin because you're going to get recessive diseases out the wazoo, right? And we still see that in areas of the world where they regularly intermarry with close family members. You see very high rates of recessive diseases. So that 1 + 1 = 2, and then you get the condition kind of thing. So we may see a little bit of that. We may see a little bit of mismatch. As we're marrying further and further outside of our own villages, outside of our own local populations, because we have, in spite of all of our PC, wanting to be very PC, we are not identical. right? And it's just the nature of how populations evolve. And eventually, if we were separated for long enough, I guarantee you we would turn into different species. It might take a really long time, but we would. And that's just how it works, because you need that intermixing to kind of homogenize, right? But with the big populations that we have now and the intermixing that we have now, that'll probably slow a little bit. We'll see more, more homogenizing over time. So,
unless society takes a really strong bifurcation, right? Like we think about this a lot in terms of the techno-futurists and this idea that, some people are going to really start leaning into some people, let's put it like, to simplify things, some people are going to end up with the internet woven into their brain stems, and some people aren't at they're over my dead body type of people, right?
Yeah.
And so you can imagine there being new populations actually that,
like an ecological niche that drives separation.
And I could see that most certainly. I mean, anything that has the potential to separate and reduce intermixing between subpopulations is going to inevitably lead to that kind of thing. It'll be faster or slower depending on the size. Size always tends to dictate how quickly or not a new mutation will spread. With really small populations, it can spread really quickly. And that's why you also tend to see higher speciation rates in small populations that have been separated from the larger populations. So, yeah, anything where you get that separation of intermixing, it will lend towards that. As to whether it occurs for long enough is another story. But
you could also imagine adaptation as a result of global pressures that are applied too, right? If the entire population, despite being homogeneous, is subject to the same, stressors or whatever it is, you could see evolution going on. In the present, in the future.
I mean, I'm sure, in third world and second world countries where situations may be more dire, there's going to be more pressure, right? If it's going to affect whether it's going to affect the health of your children and whether you pass on to the next progeny versus, some of the, and I hate using first world countries like we're all in a big race, but for want of a better word, where hopefully at least healthcare is a little bit better. That can definitely, or not, but it's also interesting to think how much healthcare has affected our population too. Because for stuff that maybe is as simple as an infection that would have probably killed most people, now is just a small bump in the road and a brief recovery, or even stuff where cesarean sections, right? Now I'm not discounting; they should still happen. You don't just let it go, right? You don't let it happen, but there may have been a natural weeding out process too. And I hate saying that. It sounds very cruel, and I'm not saying like that should happen that way, right? Like if you can fix it, you should. That's kind of humanity's theme, right? But certainly, 100 years ago or more, that may not have happened or successfully, or premature infants surviving, especially if they're really premature. The interventions just were not great. And so those individuals surviving, which is awesome, but there may be genetic variants of variety that they're introducing back into the gene pool that would have otherwise been culled. So
it's almost like you can't take the technology out of the evolution discussion at some point with human beings.
Yeah, you can't. We're going to be, even if it's not physically fused, culturally, we're already kind of fused to it, so it'll be interesting to see. It's not good or bad, right? I mean, the evolution is evolution. It's going to happen as it happens, right? But we can just make predictions about what is likely to occur, knowing what the trends tend to be. And that's science, right? It's hopefully intended to make predictions, and improve our lives, I hope. So
And is the goal of the research that you're doing, in to follow up on the theme of improving lives, is the goal to be able to find some genetic network that can then be tweaked to reverse something like autism?
So, honestly, I know that is a big hot button topic, which tends to leave, families of people on the spectrum versus people on the spectrum, at least the ones who are more verbally communicative, on opposite sides. And it's been like that for decades at this rate. I tend to veer away from that. My motivation as a scientist, I definitely want to help improve people's lives as a human being and what I hope to strive for as a relatively good person. But as a scientist, I will say I'm sort of selfish. I just want to figure shit out. That's honestly, and maybe that's the autism side of me. I want to figure out how stuff works, and because it's cool. That's that's
Well, I
like
think
the
science
biggest.
works best when it's driven just by pure
Yeah,
curiosity, to be honest. I mean, once you start trying to hammer it into something usable,
yeah,
you get really far away from the spirits of inquiry.
yeah, yeah,
You can miss a
and
lot of important things.
I hope it kind of stays like that. I know the whole granting mechanism and the university system is making that less and less possible, unfortunately. But there's still enough of us out there that got into this just because we love it, and we want to figure shit out. That is always my foundational motivation. And I know that's kind of selfish, but usually the results are good, so I'm okay with that. you know I like being able to help people out. I like, even if I think the biggest thing is understanding how our different species intermixed and what effects that's had long term, and people just wanting to learn about that because we're human and we love studying ourselves and our own history and figuring out how we tick. I that's why I do that. That's why I do that work. It's I'm definitely a very passionate patient advocate because I get to see that side also, for especially from my Ehlers-Danlos work on the other side. And that's in part more coming from me as a patient scientist, because you just get sick and tired of some of the mistreatment that often occurs within the healthcare system for people with chronic illnesses, and so that's kind of a different thing for me. That's more of my, my passion, my personal side. But as far as the science, like I said, I just love figuring biology out. It's fascinating. We learn more about ourselves, and even if at the end of the day all of this doesn't turn into something that is applied for whatever people want to do with it, treatment, intervention, whatever. I'm not even going to get into those debates. I'll leave that for other people. It's not my purview, but um, even if it's just to have an interesting time reading about how Neanderthals may have somehow had a role in autism in some people, I think that's cool. I think that's
I
cool.
mean, I think you shouldn't downplay the absolute importance of making the world a knowable place, right? It's like I teach super esoteric stuff at the university, like cosmology and astrophysics. Like
Yeah.
that stuff doesn't matter at all from a technological standpoint. It's like it's
Awesome.
very, very hard to write a grant for why studying the birth of the universe is going to impact anything on Earth, except that making the world a knowable place seems to be important to
Yeah.
our ability to thrive as individuals, right? Even if it's so much as just putting walls up so that you can live inside of a house as opposed to living just out in the world, right? It's
Right.
like,
Right.
yeah, there's a technological thing, you want to control the temperature and stuff, but there's more to it than that. There's something deeply
Yeah.
necessary about putting order on the madness. And, so much of science is looking into the past and trying to make sense of it, right? Like look at
Mhm.
people like paleontologists or archaeologists, right? What are they, they're not doing anything technological for the world.
Mm.
And but it is really valuable and awesome to understand what you are and where you came
Yeah.
from. And
Yeah.
I think that can't be overstated, even though we live in this tech-driven motivation sphere today, where it's like, yeah, you got to tell your funders exactly what you're gonna do in a technological. You're gonna build this drug or whatever. But I think that it kind of misses the point too of a lot of science, which is really
Yeah.
just making the universe knowable.
It really does. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think translational science is necessary and fantastic, and it helps us live longer and healthier, I hope. But this idea that basic science is kind of poo-pooed. We're like, well, it's still the foundation of all the translational stuff. So just because it may not have an immediate, use other than, wow, that's really cool. I didn't know that. I think is still great. It's still foundational. It's absolutely necessary. But yeah, like you said, it's really so fundamentally human is to just understand ourselves and our place in the world and our place in the universe and the big why and how and that's my biggest passion. It's what keeps me working even through the summer when I may feel like I probably should take a break, but I just love doing it. And there's nothing like being the first person to see a new result too. That's just so cool, and I wish everybody could have some element of that, right? And but then, like at this stage, when you hand it over to people and it's not yours anymore, right? And it becomes part of the human consciousness. And I like that part too. It becomes our story rather than just something that I really liked doing. But which is still a motivation for me, but I think that's the cool side of science, definitely.
And there's more to life than longevity. It's also about the quality, and the quality in some sense comes down to having some picture of what's going on, right? And I think that honestly cuts down on a lot of anxiety too, to be able to tell these stories, whether they're true or not. Like, we're doing our best to come up with stories that make sense in science, but having some stories that have some degree of reliability, or at least have the ability to be attacked for their unreliability, is actually really quite psychologically reassuring.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's part of the process. Like I said, I mean, in future iterations of this work, we're going to try our best to rip it down as best we can and rebuild it and make sure that it is continuing to stand the test of time. If it does, that's fantastic. We'll keep going and we'll continue to try and rip it down to a certain extent and rebuild and refine, because there's always noise. There's always going to be noise that we can get rid of. If at some point we rip it down and we can't rebuild it in exactly the same format, but maybe there's something else there, then great. We pivot and we follow our nose. And that's science. It's not 100% correct at any given time. It's our best guess, and that can always be updated, as it should be.
That's
May
super
take
healthy.
generations, but so.
Well, the more you learn, the more you have to learn. I think that's never going to end, honestly. But
it's cool to be able to participate in a project that, like you said, does take generations. I think that we tend to view science as being something that's been around for a really long time as participants in it. But it's such a young project in terms of all of the projects that humans have been undertaking.
Yeah.
Especially genetics or something.
Especially genetics, yeah.
good
And
Lord.
so it's just this real sense where the stories that we tell are still subject to massive improvement.
Yeah.
And as we improve them, it removes the fog of history a little bit. And that fog of history is, I think, very disconcerting, because you want to be able to look back and understand what it is that led us here, so that we can make decisions that will lead us somewhere maybe better, hopefully.
Yeah.
And not in a technological sense, but just in the sense of, the individual actions that you take. And I think that basic research is difficult because it can be hard to motivate people to find deep interest in it. Right? It's a lot easier if you have some flashy piece of technology that you've invented.
Yeah.
Where now everybody carries around a cell phone. And it's like, okay, great. Well,
you're all potential scientists.
yeah, exactly. But it's just, I think that it is the most playful place to be in science, where it's not
Yeah.
constrained by these massive obligations of producing the next new thing. It's
Yeah.
just for the sake of seeking.
Yeah.
And that's pretty cool.
And I hope that in science we are always able to retain some element of that. I know it gets harder in the university system the higher up you go, and especially the bigger the university and the closer you get to some of the Ivy League stuff, which of course, like on some level, everybody's jealous over, right? But um, those environments don't seem to be as conducive to this type of science because there's so much pressure, so much. It's an engine that is functioning off of this constant income of money, and I do get them. Money is a necessary evil, right? Like I have to get paid. I get paid by teaching so that I can do all my lovely research, right? Um, you know, people may get paid by grants, patents, etc. But I almost feel like, at institutions where I'm at, they're becoming progressively more popular amongst professors because there is a certain level of that academic freedom that's retained, and it's not as focused on that almighty dollar because, you're teaching, you've got the dollar handled, that's fine. So here's your time, here's the rest of your time, to go ahead and do the kind of research that you'd like to do. Um, would I love more money? Yes, that would be fantastic. Both in salary as well as in research income. But I don't underplay the amount of intellectual freedom that I think classically professors and scientists had and is slowly getting kind of sucked out,
Mm.
unfortunately. Um, to be in in an institution where you have to be constantly on your guard for fear of backstabbing or other aspects of politics, or and then just the constant money issue. um it's one of those, I don't think you could pay me to be enough at Harvard at that rate. Not
I think
singling out
I mean,
Harvard.
it
I love
only works
Harvard,
out,
right?
like in my experience, it was just the labs that could adapt to having a technological like some engineering focus as well would have a little bit of space
Yeah.
to play with science, but
Yeah.
it seemed like almost everybody was excelling, whether it was a new methodology or
Yeah.
some actual engineering application of
Right.
some wing of their research.
Right.
Like, I mean, I was totally funded on a DARPA and DOE grants, even though I was studying like something very, very basic, right?
Mhm.
But it was because we're able to kind of sell this dream to those funding agencies that, oh, maybe you can use this somehow, and
Yeah.
if
But
you
there's
can play
also a
that
ton of
game.
status stuff that comes from being a professor there. There was I lead backpacking tours, and there was a
Hmm.
lady on one of the tours whose brother was a professor at Harvard,
Hmm.
and she was saying that in order to, they have these parties that they host that they invite the
Hmm.
other professors to,
Hmm.
and everybody's always trying to outdo each other with the delicacies that they can order from overseas to fly in to cater the parties. And so it's just this massive engine of having to perform a certain level of status demonstration so that others think that you have good taste in addition to doing cool research. And it just made my stomach turn to think
That's
about that being a huge part of your life.
that's horrible. I mean, like, when do you have time to do science?
Well, you have a lab, right? You have this lab that's full of people that run largely with you kind of periodically checking in, but it's not,
Yeah.
professors there don't do experiments.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
like those people haven't touched the bench in a
And
long time.
I mean, like, on the one hand, it's great that you're teaching new, generations of scientists and training them and stuff. But, I mean, I remember what it was like as a grad student and having a very uninvolved mentor.
Yeah, I was gonna
And
say there's not a lot of training going on at these Ivy League schools, from what I can tell. I mean, some people get luckier than others,
I
but
think that it's
yeah,
just it's the assumption that you will show up and you will perform. Like
yeah,
if you can perform great, you're welcome, but if you can't perform at the level that's expected, they're like
yeah.
you know where the door is.
Right. Right. And somebody else will be right there to take your place.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, it's I do think like some of these other institutions are going to, I don't know. I mean, yeah, maybe we don't have the money for all the great tech and everything, but I think as far as the ideas, um
And
we
that's what
have
science is supposed to be about. It's not supposed to be about using the newest technology in
to
order to.
generate all this massive amount of data that you're never going to know what to do with.
Exactly. It's like I think that we're at a point where there's enough data that's being generated by these massive institutions that's deposited in GenBank and PubMed and all of these
Yeah.
other places that I kind of see it as an ecosystem where there's the dead whale carcass that's falling through the water column, and everybody else can feast off of that for a
Yeah.
really long time before things turn
Really,
dire.
really long time. Yeah. And still probably don't even have half of an idea of what it all means, genetics and point. I mean, it's good luck if you know what a single variant in a single gene is doing. I mean, much less the other 3 billion SNPs in your genome. So, and that's just your genome, your nuclear genome. So, and that's just in a single cell, probably in your blood. So,
Yeah, like the
um,
complexity is combinatorial once you
yeah,
start really digging into this stuff. And so it's going to take us a
massive.
really long time before we can get any sort of
Yeah.
handle on it.
Yeah. And I am looking forward to AI for some of those elements as well as, just massive processing power. It's like we're going to need that in order to really, really, I think, get to a point of having a good idea of what's going on in the human genome and how to kind of decode that.
Well, because ultimately it's
Um,
information. And it's information that
yeah,
sums and has all of these differential relationships. And
yeah,
so,
yeah,
the computational approach makes a lot of sense
yeah,
because what else is computation good for if not making sense of information?
yeah, yeah. But then always having the human on the other end to figure out what the output meant. That's
Exactly.
I mean, maybe one day we'll get there with AI, but but I think for a long time we're still going to need that human side of things. Because I mean, the AI, at least for now, they're stuck with just learning from the internet. That's their world, right? And they don't have access to everything out here.
Well, it's
So,
actually crazy because there's been a bunch of studies that show that these models experience collapse
mm,
if
mm,
trained off of information that contains AI generated output.
mm,
And so if you have
They're
an
degenerate.
they're degenerate, yeah. If you have an ecosystem that's just pure AI
mhm.
that's being used to train the next generation, they just output gibberish.
Wow.
And so they
Wow.
go from being able to interface with the real world.
Inbreeding.
Yeah,
Becomes its
absolutely.
own thing.
Yeah, it just
A
becomes
nonsensical thing,
psychotic.
yeah.
Yeah, like there was I think it was a Nature paper that just got published about this, where they were taking images and passing, pictures of dogs
Uh-huh.
through it over the course of a couple of generations. And
Mm,
you train it off of real world pictures of dogs, and it can
mhm.
generate a bunch of pictures of dogs. And then if
Right.
you take those, at 3 generations later, it's just making deformed monsters.
Yeah, I can see that.
And
I
so
forget what
it's
AI I was using. It like I wanted a fish, and there was no head. There were just tails on either end. I was like, I know what you're trying to go for, but
It's
yeah,
just I mean, I think that there is this fear that the computers will replace us, but they don't seem to be quite smart enough to generate
yeah, a fish,
sensible stuff. Oh yeah, a
a
fish, right?
dog,
Yeah, yeah,
fish, or a
exactly.
dog. Yeah. I mean, yeah, maybe someday, but I don't think any of us are going to be around by that point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Somebody
not saying
else's
it.
problem down the line.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about my students using AI so much
Mm,
to the point that they're not learning
Mm.
how to do the work. They're letting the AI do it for them. And I'm like, you do know you're training the AI to take your eventual job, right? Because if you can't do anything that the AI can't do, then you're kind of not necessary, right? It's going to be the whole factory thing all over again, right?
mm.
People's jobs are going to get replaced because it's just cheaper and it's easier and faster to having AI do certain jobs, you know.
That's why the creative assignments are so valuable, I think, honestly. Like you're asking someone to do something that the AI just can't do for them.
Can't do.
And I'm like really pushing my imagination to figure out how to realign my evaluation, like my assignments essentially, so that they are more in that generative side of things.
But I think that it has to be actually building stuff, because I think that the AIs at this point are so good at being able to generate a poem, a song, like
Not
all
necessarily
of
a
this.
new hypothesis.
I think that they can. I think that
We'll
it's
see.
like the place where I can see that humans will be for a long time superior is in the production of a physical, tangible object,
Yeah.
where it just they don't have opposable thumbs yet.
Yet.
I don't know if have you seen the Tesla robot? There's
No.
there's a video of it folding shirts. It's got a bucket of shirts, and then it's just like taking one out at a time and very slowly folding the thing and like placing it next to it. Like they're there.
Didn't something go wrong in one of those demos?
I don't think so.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Maybe
I
another
thought
one.
there was one where it like grabs the guy by the arm or something.
They do tend to do that. There was we were talking to a guy who was working at Tesla, and he was saying that they don't let people into the robot portion of the factory because the robots will sometimes grab people.
Oops.
Yeah.
You have a shirt. Let me take that one.
Cybertruck comes with a body in the trunk.
That's not good.
God. Oh man. Yeah. I think there's a lot that AI is going to be really useful for. I love it as like a naturalistic language search engine. I do worry about people going into programming right now, because I'm like, that's not going to last for very long. I mean, if you can ask it to do something, it will spit out code for you, which I love. Yeah. So I do that, because I can write way more complex code than I naturally could. But again, I need to understand the biology and the output, right? So that's why I worry about my students. Like, if you don't get to the point where you don't understand what you're putting in and what you're getting out of it, that's where AI can be really helpful, is you're already kind of an expert. So you have it do some of the other stuff that maybe takes too long for you to do, or for me, like, better coding, all that kind of stuff. Or I get stuck somewhere. I'm like, hey, what do I need to do? What am I screwing up? Right. And basically you can end up running, whereas before you could only figuratively walk. And I think that's fantastic. I love that. But you got to get to the point where you know what you're doing, and you got to know what your input and your output means. And for that, you need to do the actual work, not let the AI do your courses for you. So, and I know as college students, they're overwhelmed, they're tired, they've got so much on their plate. And and it's just like, okay, well, I'll have it write this one paper for me. And it's like, you are just taking away learning opportunity every time you do that. It's like, why go to college? Just, just don't at that rate, if you're going to do that. So, but at some point I worry about my students making themselves redundant in that way. It's like, you got to become an expert on something. That's why you're going to school. That's what makes you human, and that's what makes you valuable, to society. Otherwise we can just have AI do everything for us eventually.
There's that speciation event coming. I'm like deeply convinced that this is it. Like this is a rift that is just going to continue to grow.
It's a big one, if not like, a combo computer, hardware / human, then even just, producing, electronic copies of ourselves. I know there was a book I was reading that, and it was saying that we're going to aim for that in like 300 years time, we're going to have that. But I'm like, great. So all of the rich, wealthy people will be able to live forever as computer programs and have all the money. And then there'll be the living serfs underneath. Because, of course, it'll all start happening before they actually manage to put, regulations on it. And as usual, we let the wealthy people run our politics, so those regulations probably won't be very effective. So
Some things never change.
Yeah. I mean,
Yep.
I don't know. I think that there is a lot to be worried about, but I also think that I think about, in the history of humanity, there's at least one severe bottleneck event. And then in addition to severe bottlenecks, there's also plagues where, 30% of the population dies,
uh,
massive empires fall. Like we talked to a lot of anthropologists and they talk about this. You have a city
yeah.
in Mesoamerica, and it seems to have hundreds of thousands of people in it. There's massive complexes of these cities connected by roads, and then they just vanish. Like people just leave.
Yeah.
And it's not like the people are gone, right? There's still native Quechua Maya.
Yeah.
It just is a complete shift. And
So very often the rich people don't stay rich. There's these inversions that happen. I
You
mean,
think
for
they
better or
learn
worse.
by now, right? Like, yeah, you'd think they learn a little bit, but I guess not enough of them are historians.
this is true.
We could make all the rich people also go back and get their PhDs in history, maybe. Maybe that would help a little bit.
They could use ChatGPT.
They totally
learn a little bit.
get your PhD by ChatGPT.
It's a good slogan. All right, Emily, I think that we're almost at 3 hours, and this has been a really interesting conversation. It's really got me thinking about, the lineage of these things and the complexity of putting a linear narrative on something that really resists that.
Yeah. It like we just need to have like t-shirts. It's complicated. It's complicated.
Oh, we should make
Like the answer for like everything.
If we print those, if we end up making those, we'll send you one.
Totally. Like demystify. Complicated. I love
that a lot.
That's awesome.
But yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming by and giving us
my
so much of your
pleasure.
time. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of your workshop next.
Yeah. I'm excited about the future of it, and or wherever else my nose goes. I tend to follow it wherever, so there'll probably be other random stuff along the way as well. So,
Very nice.
but I'm really looking forward to some of the further studies we'll do on Neanderthal DNA and also Denisovan DNA, which we haven't gotten to look at yet. And because I suspect that's probably, if Neanderthal's doing something, probably the Denisovan DNA is doing something as well.
That's gonna be cool.
Yeah. So
where can people find your work if they want to follow?
So you can definitely find me on the Loyola website. I think I'm the only Casanova there. You can look me up on the psych department website. And I have my email on there. You can also find me on my blog, which is Science Over a Cuppa. And I've also got my personal Gmail of the same name on there as well. And I try to do something. I've not been as good with my blogs lately, but I used to do them very, very regularly. But apparently work happened, and it's But I try to do something every once in a while, and something science related, usually bio, evolution, autism, Ehlers-Danlos, somewhere along there.
And
So
you wrote a book about autism as well, right?
Yeah, defining autism, and we're working on a book now. Right now, I'm editing a book that I think will probably be popular because I think it's the only book on Ehlers-Danlos and neurodiversity. So I think it may end up being popular. I hope it will. And I can't say exactly where the proceeds are going. They're not going to any of the authors, FYI, but they are going to a undisclosed but relevant charitable organization, which I think every patron of the book would greatly appreciate. But unfortunately, I'm not allowed to say, according to the company, where exactly that's going to. But we have a lot of good co-authors, a lot of experts in the various fields on things like autonomic disorders and mast cell disorders, and personal stories on being on both of these spectrums. And so I'm battling with the company right now. I'm really hoping it's going to be called Issues with Our Tissues, and I'm really going to try and dig my heels in on that. So I hope that will be the name of it. But I will definitely post it on my blog. So if anybody's interested in new books, new papers, anything like that, just look me up at Science Over a Cuppa and just follow the blog, and you'll get a notification in your email. Or even if I have stuff like online research studies that people might be able to take part in, I'll post them on there as well. So that's a good way to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of my scientific and advocacy work. So, but yeah,
Cool.
I think that's a
Yeah,
major.
way to be out there. That's awesome.
Yeah, I try. I have had the blog since 2012. So like I said, originally it was a weekly blog. So, but I do try and keep up with some of that. And it's a little bit of everything. So, yeah, but I'll definitely post new stuff on there.
Very cool.
So,
All right. Yeah, folks, keep an eye on it. We will. And yeah,
Cool.
look forward to checking out that book when it comes out too.
awesome. And I look forward to the t-shirt.
Excellent.
We do need to work on our promotional side of things.
Our swag.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, Emily. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you so
All
much.
right. You too. It's been
Yeah,
awesome.
It's
You
been
take
awesome.
care.
See ya.
Bye. Bye.